over last class. Make sure this is perfect. That's working. Okay. So we talked about crime a little bit last class in terms of the foundations like warrants and some of our rights. So we got through to about here last class. We talked about criminal law versus civil law. We talked about criminal procedure, that idea of when you need a warrant, what the exceptions are. We talked through the different evidence gathering under the Fourth Amendment. We talked to our Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. We learned about the Miranda rights from the Miranda versus Arizona case. So a lot of just our kind of protections in a criminal law setting. We ended class discussing the Eighth Amendment, the idea of cruel and unusual punishment, and essentially the death penalty. And we looked at an article from Time Magazine in that regard. Now we're going to look at the specific business crimes, and I'm going to share an example of one of these with you. Some teachers, because we've looked at students a couple times doing bad things, right? The fraternity party and a couple other situations. I want to show you guys an example of teachers too, so we're not being biased here. So jumping through to where we left off, there's the case. Here we go. So these are the specific crimes we'll be discussing today. We're going to start with this one called RICO. Okay, this is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, RICO. A little easier to remember than the whole thing, right? And close the door here. So when I'm telling you about these general criminal laws, these vary state by state. So this is just generally what the rules are. Generally in Maryland, the idea of racketeering is a pattern of illegal activity. And you have to carry it out as part of a business organization, as part of an enterprise. And if you're doing kind of two or more illegal things, illegal crimes, you're engaging in something like fraud, bribery, embezzlement, which we'll talk about in just a moment, RICO makes it so that if you're doing that, you can get up to 20 years or more in prison. So the idea here is saying if you're engaging in a couple of crimes, and you're doing it as part of an organized group, working toward illegal activity, not only could you be responsible for the crimes and the punishments as a part of that, we can have an even more severe crime under the RICO Act. Who do you think this was designed to protect against?
Mafia.
Thank you. Yeah, mafia, mobs, really that idea of organized crime.
So this is kind of separately, does it make the penalties for the specific crimes more severe, or is this considered separate crime?
Great question. So Jonah's saying, is this a separate crime, or does it just make the crimes you engaged in more severe? This is considered a separate crime. You're violating RICO. So this is something where you can be responsible separately for fraud, separately for bribery, and then also have charges against you under the RICO Act. By having charges against you under the RICO Act, you're looking at even deeper sentencing. I'll tell you, prosecutors, especially some of the ones we visited in Maryland, they don't always want to go forward against different people for the wrong things they do with 5 different criminal charges. They could get you for all of these things separately, but they'd rather just go after you for the harshest one. So by just using RICO, going after the harshest charges, sometimes that's a strategy because the jury can get really confused. So remember, the jury has to be instructed about exactly what's required under each of these crimes. If they get all confused, it might end up in a situation where the person's just found innocent. So sometimes they'll focus on the harshest crime and try to get the jury to understand how that harshest crime was violated, work toward that larger sentence, and that's where RICO can be helpful. So before I show you an example of RICO, I will show you one having to do with teachers, not just the mafia. I want to talk to you about what some of those specific crimes are. So let's start with fraud. What's fraud? Because we've seen this before. We saw this in tort law when people are looking for money in civil cases. What's fraud? Wake up, it's the start of the week. We all know what fraud is, and it's on the board, right? We have the answer. What's fraud? Go ahead, Brian. Yeah, it's taking property from somebody else, right? It's lying, it's deception. So here, the deception for the purpose of taking money, lying to try to gain money or other property from someone is fraud. And there's different types. It can be bank fraud. For example, you know you can deposit money right into a bank? You take your check that you got and you take out your iPhone or your Samsung phone, whatever phone you had, and you take a picture of the check and it automatically deposits it in your account, right? Mm-hmm. But you could write yourself a check for $1 million, right? Deposit that into your account. Some of those funds will be available right away. That's fraud, right? So bank fraud is a very serious crime. We also see things like mail and wire fraud, insurance fraud. So if your house burns down and you tell them there was a Ferrari you had parked inside it and 20 big screen TVs and you try to get all the money reimbursed for all the stuff that was supposedly in your house, or even Medicare fraud. Okay, and that's a big problem. Medicare fraud, we see a lot of people taking money from the government saying, hey, we're providing health service to these patients that don't actually exist. And so they're able to collect money from our government under Medicare, again, using these lies and deceptions to profit. So I have an example of fraud for you. We've talked about this a little bit before in terms of the Equifax breach, right? So Equifax, their security, unfortunately, the site got breached. They're one of the big creditors, and like 14 million users were affected in America. That could be a great example of fraud. If one of them gets a hold of your information, they can use that to take out credit cards in your name, to start bank accounts in your name, to, basically use your credit in any way that they want to. Here you see another example of fraud. This is really common. It's done through emails. See how it says, scams, Nigerian prince wants to give me money? So this is one you may have seen before. I know it's hard to see on the screen. I'm going to click to it so you can see the actual wording here. There we go. So here we go. A Nigerian prince wants to give me money. No, he does not. But here's what you'll see. A common example is this email where he says he needs to transfer $40 million obtained from an oil contract. But he can't use an African bank account, and so he needs your assistance. And he asks you for your personal bank account number, and he's going to send over some money, and it gets sketchy, right? What's sketchy about this? What's he asking for? It seems kind of weird. Go ahead, Henry.
Did you need to make a Nigerian bank account?
Yeah, so you might need to make this like Nigerian based account. What else, Maddie? You're about to say? Yeah, your personal information. If anyone's asking you for things like your bank account number, your social security number, something seems weird, it probably is a scam. The other thing you'll notice is a lot of time there's a lot of typos in the email, and pay attention to where the email's coming from. It might not be from the actual corporation, the actual organization. Businesses are really nervous about this because many organizations now have had security breaches like Equifax has. And so they'll even send out fake scams to see if you're the person who opens the email when you shouldn't. So as you're working in these various organizations, I know many of you work, as you start using the computer more and more in your role, be careful, because IT is practicing now. They'll send out these red flags, phishing scams, send out these emails to see, are you the person leaving the company vulnerable by clicking on that email? Because of this, there's been breaches at a lot of schools. There's been breaches at places like the Office of Personnel Management. A lot of federal government employees' information got leaked. So they have companies like, I think it's called My ID Protection, that are set up to help kind of flag these types of issues, and a lot of banks do as well. They'll monitor your credit and let you know if something's happening you're not sure of. Because of the Equifax breach, I've encouraged all of you to just freeze your accounts. If something like this happens, it's really difficult. So if you fall victim to a scam, you can submit to the Federal Trade Commission, you can tell the Postal Service, there's an Internet Crime Complaint Center. You can even call your local Secret Service office. The police, you can file a report with them, and you should. Do you think anyone actually goes after them very well? I see some people saying, no, why not? Hard to find, yeah. It's hard. It can be hard to trace, and sometimes it's just not enough money that the government wants to waste its resources. What else, Jeremy?
I was going to say, sometimes, like, even if there's a couple things. I know I got into my in-laws about it. They were all upset that someone spent $500 on their credit card and the cops didn't do anything. I said, the cops aren't going to do anything because the bank already paid you back.
Exactly. So you can get paid back through the banks. That's a customer service method. If someone steals money from you, raise your hand if this has happened to you. This happens to me way too many times. Someone gets a hold of your credit card, or even just a debit card, and they can even take cash out somehow with that. But on top of that, they'll go out and they'll start spending lots of money in your name. Anyone experienced that? Keep your hand up if the bank pays you the money back. Yeah, most banks have fraud protection. So if someone goes out and spends $400 at Macy's and it was not you, you can say, they'll usually alert you within a day or so, this seems weird, what's going on in your account, and then they'll usually give you the money back. The process can take a little while, so if you were counting on that and you live paycheck to paycheck, it's still not a great place to be in. Jonah?
They're pretty good, though. I've found in the past, say, 10 years, they've gotten infinitely better, and the alerts come almost immediately. I mean, I feel that they're overly cautious, but I'd rather that because I've had to cancel too many credit cards because of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this going on, more so now than it was 10 years ago, and so the banks have gotten great at detecting, like, this pattern seems off course from what you normally do. For instance, if all of a sudden there's charges in Texas, while you're also using your credit card in Massachusetts, they're going to say, this seems kind of funky. And often it'll just be that they do a quick phone call to check in. So, for example, when someone got a hold of my credit card, they called my husband because the person had spent, I think it was $600 at Bloomingdale's, and I had never shopped there before. It just wasn't one of the stores I shop at. And so they call my husband and they go, is this you trying to place a $600 charge at Bloomingdale's? And he's like, I don't know. Is my wife spending all my money while I'm at work? I'm not sure. So he checks in with me and finds out, obviously, I'm not spending $600 at Bloomingdale's. And they're able then to refuse the charge even from happening. So they don't have to reimburse. The credit card just doesn't work for that customer. And then you can put a freeze on the card and get a new one so that it's no longer being used. So they're pretty good about it, but you also have to be pretty vigilant as well. So I'll give you an example of this. I was not smart. A lot of times you're doing human resource forms when you start a new job or for other purposes, and they'll ask you to put your social security on those forms, right? If you do student loan information, a lot of times they need your social security. So I put my social security on this form and I mailed it through our interoffice mail at the college over to Human Resources. Somehow from my office in the mail here to Human Resources, it never made it to Human Resources. So I'm contacting them going, hey, you didn't sign my form, and they're like, we never got your form. So somehow someone got into that mail and took that form, took my social security number, and they were able to open a number of accounts in my name, credit line in my name, credit cards in my name. I mean, they did a lot of damage within about a day when one of the banks finally alerted me. And, it stinks. Then my husband and I are frantically trying to shut off all these different accounts. You don't even know where they've opened accounts, so you're just kind of guessing which banks, because you don't always have to do a line of credit to open a bank account. So we're kind of trying to chase it all down, and we're having to freeze all the accounts, and it's time consuming. And then it's stressful. It can take some time to get the money back. Some of the banks you had to physically go in person, between 9 to 5 when some people are working, right? So that can be difficult. And then you can report the claim to the police, but, they don't do much because eventually you get the money back. So this kind of thing just keeps happening. So if it happens to you, this is a great identity theft resource center I've given you a link to where you have some information about what you can do, like filing a police report, clearing your name with the collection agency. If they go out and take out a lot of credit lines and they're getting decline, it can hurt your credit. So I recommend, again, just freeze all of your credit accounts because we just had a big breach through Equifax. You might have had your information stolen without noticing. And so we want to make sure you're not having someone spending in your name. So there's my big fraud speech for you. Moving on from fraud, we're going to talk about money laundering and embezzlement. These are two really important business crimes. Sometimes people get confused. So I'm going to tell you the difference between these two, and then I'm going to give you an example to help illustrate it and see which one you think it is. So money laundering. Okay, this is what I say in a nice way is making dirty money clean. Using profits of criminal acts to promote more crime or to conceal an illegal source of money. So the drug dealers I knew when I was younger that went to jail, here's why. They didn't have jobs. And they get lots of money drug dealing, and they go out and they buy like a fancy car and fancy coats and kind of a red flag, right? Where'd you get the money to buy those things? So this is a big problem. When you're engaging in illegal conduct, you're doing something like drug dealing, you're getting lots of cash, it can be difficult as it's starting to pile up. If you're using it, it's a big red flag, you could get caught, okay? Because they're wondering, well, where'd this money come from? So people engaging in that type of criminal activity will try to make the money clean through other routes. Here's my illustration of this. Raise your hand if you've seen the TV show Breaking Bad. Yes, I still got like half of you. Sometimes I ask about TV shows and then I feel really old that I referenced it. So someone who raised their hand, what, like in one sentence, how would you describe Breaking Bad for the other members of our class? Go ahead, Maddie.
They use Walt's money to open a car wash.
Good.
So use the dirty money to like turn it into a business, so it looks normal.
So Maddie jumped right to they bought a car wash. So let's talk about, for the people who don't know, like this guy Walter White, what was he doing?
He was the kingpin.
Okay, yeah, so we're kind of hating on teachers today. He was a public school teacher, right? And a chemistry teacher in a public school, and he finds out what? He has cancer, and he's going to die. And he's going, I want to leave my family with some money. I need to make sure they're all set. So he decides he's going to start making crystal meth. Sounds like a good idea.
No.
Did I wake you up? It's like early in the morning. Hopefully that woke you up. We're going to talk about drugs and keep you awake. Okay. So he decides, I'm going to start making crystal meth. And he's a science teacher, so he's great at it, right? He makes the best crystal meth. And he's selling it. And the money's piling up because he's doing a really good job, right? So imagine this. You have stacks of these like $100 bills. Sounds fun, right? I don't start drug dealing after today's discussion. So he has all these stacks of money, and he's like, how do I make it so that we can actually keep this and use this money without, getting in trouble with the police? A science teacher back where he's from maybe was making $30,000, $40,000 a year. So you can't go buying Ferraris with that, right? So he wants to make it clean. So as Maddie said, he opens a car wash with his wife. And the way that you money launder in the car wash, can you have a car wash as a regular legal business?
Yes.
Yeah, and customers come in and they pay like $15, $20 and they get their car washed, and that's great. To money launder, they have a pretend customer come in. Right, so no customers walked in the door and they say, Sinya, you need $200 worth of work to your car. We need to detail it, clean it really well. So they put in this fake Sinya customer. They charge her $200, and then they take their drug money, right, their pile of drug money out of the backpack, and they put it in the cash register. So they make fake customers. They pretend there's profits that aren't really there, and then they pay using that drug money, and now the money's clean. Money laundering, cleaning the money. Easy to remember? Hopefully. Go ahead, Henry.
There's another show actually that's a lot better with money laundering. Have you ever heard of the Ozarks?
I have not heard of the Ozarks.
You should definitely watch
So-
this.
There's another good example for you guys, Ozarks. I just haven't heard of it. I'm going to use my old Breaking Bad example, I guess, for now.
I would recommend watching that.
Okay. In ample free time, so at the end of the semester, we can all hopefully watch it. I'm going to move on from money laundering to embezzlement. This is a little different. Here you have legal access to money, and you're using it in a way you should not be. Okay, so embezzlement is fraudulent conversion of another personal property by a person in lawful possession of it. A good way to think of this from a business perspective, if you have access to the business's financial accounts, and you're supposed to be using that to buy business things like a car for the business, and you go out and buy yourself, a Lamborghini instead. You had legal access to use that account, you just weren't supposed to use it to buy a Lamborghini, right? You're supposed to use it to buy computers for the office and things that the office actually needs, the business needs. More often, you'll see this, sometimes people at a smaller scale will get a business credit card, and they'll use it to buy themselves all kinds of nice clothes and anything that they want, when they're supposed to be using it only for business-related expenses. That can be fraud, right? It can also be embezzlement. You'll see this on a larger scale. I'll give you an example. I had a friend, I won't say, not a friend, I had an acquaintance I knew back home. How's that? Okay. Remember, we're keeping it hypothetical. So I had this acquaintance I knew back home, and his wife worked for an organization called Wounded Warriors. It's a nonprofit organization that helps veterans from our country. Sounds like a good service, right? Helping our military? Yeah, right? That's a great organization.
Yeah.
She had legal access to funds from that organization. The idea was to help provide those funds to the veterans, to help them, our military members, to help those in need. She was using those funds for her own personal gain. She took a private jet on a vacation and paid for the private jet and the vacation using money from the Wounded Warriors, amongst a number of other examples. She was found guilty and sent to jail of embezzlement. Okay, because she was taking that money she had access to in her role as part of Wounded Warriors and was using it for her own personal gain. So there's your example of embezzlement. I want to show you a scenario and see if you know what the difference is. We have an accountant who opens a dry cleaning business. In this business, he accepts cash only from customers to pay for dry cleaning services. This business is in a very remote location with few actual customers, yet profits are very high. Would the accountant's actions most likely be money laundering or embezzlement? Good, you guys are all going to ace the exam, right? Because we have a scenario here. We've spent some time talking about the distinction of this. Money laundering is very likely, or embezzlement, going to be on the exam. So remember, money laundering is with pretend customers. Dirty money is being made clean. That's a great illustration we see in the dry cleaning. Eduardo, you have a question?
Yeah, I was saying that, it is laundering, money laundering. That's
Yes,
laundering.
money. You're saying it is money laundering?
Yeah.
Perfect. So this is a great example of money laundering. Okay, here we don't have legal access to funds. We're using them in a wrong way as we would at embezzlement. We're just taking money from an illegal activity and making it clean by making basically pretend profits. We're moving on now to another crime. Again, this is in general. You'll see in each state they have their own specific instructions about what's required to find someone guilty of a crime. So I'm going to show you in general larceny, and then I'll show you in Maryland what that looks like, okay? So in general, larceny is theft. Who's heard of larceny before? A few of you, good, because you did the reading, right? Raise your hand if you've heard the word robbery before. Everyone's heard robbery. So they're basically the same thing. The reason you hear robbery more often is because robbery has this extra element of force or threat of force. It's stealing with force or threat of force, and most often if someone is breaking into your home, there's some type of force or some type of threat happening. So often it's going to be the level of robbery rather than just larceny. Okay, so I'll talk through what larceny is, and then I'll show you the robbery statute here in Maryland. So trespassery, taking a personal property of another with the intent to steal it, and it does require some type of movement in doing so. Okay, remember, for each crime there has to be a mental state and an action. The mens rea is the mental state, and the action is the actus reus. We talked about that last class. So what's the mens rea here? What mental state do you need to have?
You want to take it.
You have to have, thank you, Sinya, intent. You have to actually be intending to steal a property. And then what's the action you have to have? Yeah, some type of movement. Okay, some type of movement. So this has to be personal property. It can't be professional services, something intangible. But for personal property, you can be found guilty of larceny, just essentially theft without force. Now, robbery is the most it's the biggest form of theft because it has that extra element of force or threat of force. So again, in Maryland, this is what our statute requires. Very similar elements to what I just described for larceny, except on top of that, we have this extra element of force being added to it. So again, you have to have trespassed, meaning you're on someone else's property or you've taken somebody else's property without consent. You take and carry away the property. That's where we see that movement piece being used. Of the alleged victim, so it has to be property of the actual person who's complaining. There's the intent piece, the mens rea. You have to intend to steal from that person. And again, to make it more than just larceny, to make it robbery, there has to be force or threat of force. So an example of this, you guys work in a business organization, you might have employees stealing things from the store. Are they usually using force or threat of force to do so? No. So they would be guilty probably of larceny, right? Now, force or threat of force, if someone breaks into your home, comes in, takes your TV, and leaves, are they guilty of larceny or robbery? Robbery. Okay? Here we see there can be force. It can be that they've broken a window, right, to get into your home, some type of force happening, or they could bring a gun with them when they do it. I'll show you an example in a moment here of a robbery that happened in Maryland. I want to share with you the issue with the mens rea piece, the intent piece of theft. So here's what happens. You walk into the store. Anyone go to a store today? It's pretty early in the morning. Gia, where'd you go? Starbucks? What'd you get at Starbucks? A coffee? Okay, and then let's pretend that Gia really, really needs some sugar for her home. So she takes a bunch of sugar, like handfuls of sugar like this, and she puts it in her purse and she walks out. What's Gia guilty of? She's innocent until proven guilty. Gia's a good person, right? But if we want to find her guilty of a crime, you said larceny? So trespassing, she probably should not be taking that person's property, right? That was business property. She took and carried away that property, the sugar, of the Starbucks. Here's the issue. Was there force or threat of force? No, that's why you call it larceny. It wasn't hers. She took it from the Starbucks. Did Gia intend to steal?
Yes. Yeah,
She's
taking the.
Some of you are saying, yeah, she was thinking about stealing.
coffee. I'm supposed to get the sugar.
Yes.
Yeah, not 2 pounds.
So Gia's gonna argue she did. Maybe she likes 2 pounds of sugar in her coffee.
Sugar with coffee.
There we go. So Gia might really need those 2 pounds of sugar for her coffee, or she can argue, oh, I didn't know those were in there. Right? I didn't know that those sugars were in there. They must have fallen in. Whoops. And so she gives back the sugar. Here you go, Starbucks. Sorry about that. And now Starbucks is wondering, well, did she intend to actually steal those? And so that's the issue in a lot of stores. When someone is shoplifting, when they're stealing property from the store, you run into issues of intent to steal. Just because they walked out of the store with the property, they could argue, whoops, I forgot that was in my bag. I didn't mean to put down that necklace and leave it on. I just walked out. I forgot I had it on, officer.
Oh, that's a problem with toddlers.
And that can be a toddler with kids. Thank you, Sinya. What do kids do?
They take things and you don't realize.
Yeah, so your children, a lot of parents, their kids are in strollers and they're kind of walking by and they grab stuff off the shelves and they just keep walking. And suddenly they have candy and all the toys and everything they wanted, right? Totally free. So because of this issue of intent, you're innocent till proven guilty. Many companies have strict policies where you can't do a lot if someone's shoplifting. So they don't want to run into an issue where they're being sued because you went after someone who actually wasn't trying to steal. Sinya's kid grabbed something off the shelf. She wasn't trying to steal. And then you, in front of all of her friends, take her and put her in a back room and you're going, you committed a crime, you stole, and suddenly we have defamation issues. We could have assault and battery if you forcefully grab her and take her into the back room. You could have all these issues arising. So a lot of companies say, we'd rather just lose the, $10 worth of sugar Gia took and not have to have lawyers and all these things present to deal with this issue in court if they decide to sue for some of the civil issues that could arise from this. So be careful if you own a business. Customers stealing from your store, you can absolutely report them to security. You can try to move forward. If the prosecution decides to move forward with a claim of theft, it can be difficult to prove based on this issue here. Now, when we went to the court visit, we all did a couple years ago, there was another visit where we observed a case where it was a couple who had stolen from the Montgomery Mall. They didn't just steal one pair of sunglasses, they stole like 20 pairs of sunglasses. It's much harder than to argue they didn't intend to steal, right? Because we can say, whoops, one thing of sugar, one thing of sunglasses, maybe you didn't mean to, but when there's 20, why else would you be doing that, right? So that's where you run into some bigger issues. I saw a hand up.
Oh,
Go ahead, Eduardo.
so so the intent is when the person is catching before leaving the store. The person is taking things before leaving the store. But if the alarm sounds, it could be an intent, or it could be no.
So just because the alarm sounds doesn't necessarily mean there's intent. For instance, anyone ever go shopping and they forget to take the tag off the clothing? So you walk out and it rings and it looks like you're stealing. Were you?
Yeah.
No, because we're all good people in this class, right? And so what happens is they just forgot to take it off. So it's not that you were trying to steal. Usually you can show a receipt showing the item, but they might have forgotten to bring it up too. So it's not that just because the alarm went off didn't mean you intended to steal anything. And sometimes my favorite thing is it doesn't go off when you leave the store and you keep shopping around the mall, and then it goes off like in the third store you go into instead. Doesn't mean you meant to steal. So it's a hard thing to prove there's this intention. I have examples here for you of these crimes happening in Maryland just to bring them into a business perspective. So, if you work in a bar or restaurant or you want to own one day, anyone heard of the Tasty Diner? It's a diner in Prince George's County, so they have surveillance video. A lot of times that's helpful. In this situation, we see there was a person who came into the diner. They had witnesses at the diner that they were interviewing. It's at 12:45 in the morning. There we go. They were wearing masks and dark clothes when they came into the diner. They said the robbers threw the cashier onto the floor. They threatened his life. They took the butt of the gun and they hit him in the head with the gun. They didn't shoot him with it, but they hit him in the head with it. This guy felt like they were going to kill him. They did all of this to get $140 from the diner. So is this an example of larceny, robbery, or would you argue neither?
Robbery.
Why is this robbery?
Because we
Force.
Okay, so we see force. Thank you, Gia. Go ahead. You said there's force?
Yes.
There's threatening, right? So he hits him with a gun. He threatens him. Okay? Going back here, I know it's hard to see. There we go. Trespassing, so he's not there for the reason he should be at the business, and he takes and carries away, what was the property he took and carried away?
Money.
Yeah, the $140. Seriously, over that. Criminals are not smart. So then he took it from the business, and again, we see threat. So that's a great example where we see robbery being illustrated in Maryland.
But
I'm
it
gonna
has
move-
to be a certain amount.
That's a great question. The amount of money can make it a more severe penalty. So some is just petty theft. It might not, you stole chapstick, it's still theft. But you might not be facing as severe charges as you would be if you stole, $1,000 worth of merchandise. So the value can come into play. I'll give you an example of this. I had a wonderful student who was the parent of a few different kids, and one of her kids went to, I think it was Kohl's. It was one of the it was a major store you've heard of, and their friends that they were with stole probably $20 worth of cosmetics. Not a lot of stuff, right? Do you think that prosecutors normally would go after you for that?
No.
No, but Kohl's did. Kohl's did. They said you had theft, and they went after them for a tort, for civil. They wanted to get their money back. And so even though it was only like $20 worth of stuff, and she didn't actually steal it, her friends did, under Maryland law, she was still responsible. And usually it's for 3 times the value, because you've taken away that property from the store, they're not able to sell it, and then you've caused them some issues. So they were charging her with like a $100 fine, and they felt it was worth going after her. Because by having this policy, hopefully less children would be in their store stealing things. I say children, she was a teenager, sorry, less teenagers. So depending on the value, some people might not bother going after you, but others out of principle could. So don't steal, right? Senor, you have a question, go ahead.
But what happened with people that go to restaurants and they have dinner and drinks and everything, and then they left? So is that larceny or?
So if you have some, let's go back to the example here. You're in a restaurant, you're there for a legitimate reason, right? You're eating, having dinner. You take and carry away, technically the food, it's in your stomach when you walk out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's some movement there. The property is the food, it's from the restaurant. And did you intend to steal it if you did not pay the bill?
Yeah.
Yes.
But you're gonna argue, what?
I forgot to
You
pay.
forgot.
I forgot to pay, good job, Eduardo. I
You have
forgot
an
to pay,
emergency.
and that's again where the intent issue will happen for the restaurant. You can say, oh, I thought my husband paid, whoops. So that's where you can have an issue, but certainly it could be larceny. Was there any force or threat of force?
No.
So probably not robbery, but they can be guilty of theft still. You're still stealing, even if it's not money, it's something of value. Okay? So don't walk out on your checks. It's also mean to the waitresses and waiters, right?
In the restaurant.
Sometimes they make the waiters and waitresses pay for those checks you walked out on, so
Yeah.
don't do
Oh,
it. Arson's another really important business crime. Okay, and you see a house on fire here, using any type of fire or explosives to damage or destroy property, usually with malicious or fraudulent intent. Okay, willfully trying to burn a building down, or because you're trying to commit maybe insurance fraud. So you decide, hey, my house is underwater, it's not worth as much as I paid for it. If I burn it down, I can hopefully get a payout from the insurance company and just walk away. So you go ahead and burn the whole house down. That can be fraudulent intent, right? You do it maliciously, you set a fire. Arson is something that we can see in businesses. They're losing money, they're not doing well, they could decide to try to collect the insurance money as fraud, and they'll burn the business down. You'd think this wouldn't happen that often. Again, another acquaintance from back home. I lived in a small town. I don't know why there was so much trouble. I lived in Northampton, Massachusetts. I don't know. Unfortunately, thanks to Facebook, we were friends. So I had to defriend the person because, careful about the company you keep. This guy that I went to high school with went and burned down about 10 houses in Northampton. And so if you think about that, he's lighting them on fire, and it's at night. Who's usually home in the house at night?
Everybody's sleeping.
Yeah.
Everyone, kids, children, their parents sleeping. So this is a really dangerous crime because not only have you destroyed property, you're doing so in a really malicious way. It's reckless. You could endanger someone's lives. And we see the California fires going on right now. People are dying and getting injured from those. This is a really serious problem. And so arson is something you can be found guilty for and is considered a business crime because many can do it for fraudulent reasons. I know you want to know what happened to my Facebook friend / acquaintance. He went to jail. Okay, and his Facebook page says get him out of jail, but I don't feel that bad for him. Here's a local example of this. We saw a Baltimore man was charged. Raise your hands if you've heard of CVS Pharmacy.
No.
There's a CVS Pharmacy. This is an example here where a Baltimore man got charged by the Department of Justice for burning down the CVS Pharmacy. And you'll see those committing arson took advantage of our city when we were most vulnerable. This is when there was the riots going on in Baltimore City. The actions caused over $1 million of damage to this community. And so this is an example here where they said, right here, there were 2 still photographs of a suspect in the arson to the media, announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to the suspect's identification, arrest, and conviction. So they were able to get this person, because people had taken pictures during the riots, and then they asked for more information, gave a reward to get it, and this person got in trouble for burning down the business. And think about that, it's not just the physical inventory inside CVS, which is a lot, and the business building, which is also worth a lot of money. CVS wasn't able to serve its customers for weeks after that. So this is really a lot of money just from using, one lighter to light something on fire. So arson is a very, very serious crime. So now we're gonna get to the additional crimes. This is I'm sorry, not yet. I gotta go back to RICO. I told you guys I was gonna give you an example with the teachers. So now that we've learned about the types of crimes you can be engaged in under RICO, remember this is engaging in a couple of these crimes, working towards a legal activity as part of a business enterprise or an organization. And again, who is this RICO Act? What's the purpose of it? To protect against 2? Mafia, organized crime, to have more severe penalties, 20 years or more in prison if you're engaging in this type of organized crime. Now we have more punishment we can do. Well, it's geared for the mafia, but here we see an example of RICO where it went for teachers who were involved in a cheating scandal. So this punishment, the severe punishment, can be used for other organizations as well. Now before I show this to you, I'm going to give you some options today, so I like to give my students options so you have the learning experience you want. Option number 1, we can do an activity around this issue regarding the teachers cheating, and you can practice using RICO. And then we will move on into a very short overview of the other additional crimes. Option number 2, so we can have more Q&A and spend more time on the additional crimes, we will go over this together. You won't do a group activity today, and we can spend more time talking about the additional crimes. So the kind of difference between option 1 and 2, option 1, you'll do a group activity like we usually do in class. Option 2, we're going to move forward so you can ask some questions and keep moving on with the business crime material. So raise your hand if you want option 1. No one wants to do a group activity? Oh. Option 2? Oh, we're unanimous almost, okay. So this is why I ask you sometimes, I want to give you guys the time you want to spend on the additional crime. So I'm going to show you this example. To do so, I'm going to show you a video first of what happened, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. So this is a quick video regarding this crime. Oh, first we have to watch the ad.
Kayak can't search hundreds of pants.
We can't get the ad out of there, so I'll show you the video in a moment. You're going to see Judge Baxter in a moment, and some of the teachers on trial here. He's upset because they've refused a plea deal.
Do you all have anything to say about the decision today? This morning, 10 Atlanta public school educators now out on bond, some planning their appeals.
All rise.
After a judge sentenced them to prison on Tuesday for a years-long cheating scandal, changing answers on standardized tests.
Everybody in the education system at APS knew that cheating was going on, and your client promoted it.
Judge Derry Baxter doling out prison sentences to 8 of the former educators, punishments for the crime of racketeering, charges normally reserved for putting away violent mobsters.
There were thousands of children that were harmed in this thing. This is not a victimless crime that occurred in this city.
According to the indictment, the cheating conspiracy dates back to 2001, and for at least 4 years between 2005 and 2009, the educators altered, fabricated, and falsely certified test answers. 3 of the educators faced the harshest sentence, 7 years in prison and 13 years of probation, a punishment that some of the defense attorneys strongly fought.
I am making a motion for you to recuse yourself from sentencing my client, since you are not making your decision based. Apparently, you're going back and forth based upon motion. You said who was ready to be sentenced.
You sit down, I'm going to put you in jail. If you yell at me, point at me.
You're yelling at me, Judge.
Judge Baxter actually agreed to leniency the day before sentencing, allowing prosecutors to offer plea deals on Monday, but only 2 took them.
I was trying to give everybody one more chance, and, probably going to have tomatoes thrown at me, but, nobody took it. Nobody took it, so, things change.
I know
And all I want from any of these people is just to take some responsibility. But they refuse. And I am convinced that your client recruited those two retired teachers and cheated on that test.
Now, the 7-year sentences were reserved, according to the judge, for those three at the top of this scandal. And according to CNN affiliate WSB, they were much longer than the 3-year sentences that were offered by the state as part of a proposed deal by the district attorney. And the judge, when they defined those, more than doubled them. The two who accepted the deals apologized and offered their apologies for their guilt in this case, and were offered one 6 months in jail on the weekends only, the other home confinement.
Okay, so we saw.
But you cannot work anymore in that school. So your degree.
So we saw a plea deal here for a couple of the educators. One of them got 6 months in jail only on the weekends. Why is that? Why just on the weekends?
To work during the week.
So they can work. They can keep being a teacher, right? You think
No.
it's gonna be hard to get a teaching job after that? Maybe, I don't know. You hope so, right? You hope so. The other person, it was home confinement. So, that way they're able maybe to still work, like they can teach online, right? There we go. So, I'm going to show you here, we have our module
They
activity
were
on this.
taking money for changing the grades or
So,
what?
let's talk about what the problem is here. So this is the cheating scandal, right? This is out of Atlanta, Georgia. This is our activity we are going to do. We're talking about it together. So here's what happens. They have indictments, they press charges against these 11 faculty for nearly a 2-year investigation. They look at test scores dating back to 2005. And they first had these allegations. They kind of came up in 2008 when the Atlanta Journal reported on statistically improbable increases. So basically what they were saying was, all of a sudden, all these students are getting rock star grades on these tests. And they can't just assume you guys are great students, right? They were saying it's statistically improbable that all of a sudden there'd be such a big jump, right? We can have some students be better students, but really that was kind of unrealistic to have all of a sudden everyone getting all A's on the test. So looking at that, it's not that they're saying the students were wrong, they're saying, this is a red flag, we should probably look into this, the data seems flawed. So they start looking into it, and in 2009 they found similar increases at a dozen more schools. The stories eventually led the governor at the time to appoint 2 special investigators, who in 2011 found cheating in 44 of 56 of the schools that they looked at. They didn't even look at all the schools. And in all, they found 178 educators had cheated on these tests. So the former Georgia attorney, his name was General Michael Bowers, was one of the 2 investigators. He said a team of them conducted 2,100 interviews. They reviewed 800,000 documents. He said what they heard from some teachers, they'd actually been forced to cheat. He said it left him in tears. I went to West Point, he said I saw 22 out of 20, or 23 guys being executed. I'm really tough, but he was really upset because he saw, here's an example of this woman, and she said, Mr. Bowers, this is a big joke. You can't imagine how badly I feel. I cheated, I was forced to cheat, I had no choice. I spent my days as a teacher combing hair, brushing teeth, making sure children had something to eat. I taught 3rd grade and I cheated. If my father were alive, he'd be so ashamed, he wouldn't know what to do. This is a teacher who said she felt forced to cheat. She was a single mother. She wanted her paycheck, and she has her bosses directing her, like, hey, you need to give the students this information for the test. Me and your other professors constantly are telling you not to plagiarize, not to engage in academic misconduct, right? Why are these teachers promoting it in the elementary schools? Henry?
So the school can look a lot better.
So the school can look better, and what else? Thank you, Allison. You can get paid more. So as a school, a lot of the funds come from federal, state, and local governments. You often get paid more for the performance of the students in those schools. How many students are completing, getting their high school diplomas? What are their grades on these tests? And some of the money can be correlated to it. So by inflating the test scores and cheating, they're not only lying and engaging in fraud, in a way they're embezzling taxpayers' dollars as well. So yes, we see issues of fraud here, the crime we just discussed. There could be issues of embezzlement. There's a lot of things going on here that seem like it's not okay. They wanted to have really harsh penalties because this was such a pervasive crime. And because really, who was being hurt here?
Taxpayers, the students,
Taxpayers, like
community.
citizens, the community. It made the Atlanta, Georgia area not look so great at these community schools. This was happening, and these are children, right? Everyone loves the little kids. And so here we see them being pretty tough. The judge was being pretty tough, and he gave them these plea deals. He negotiated with them. He just wanted them to say we did something wrong. You know, he didn't want to throw a bunch of educators in jail necessarily. You know, it wasn't necessarily a violent crime. It's a white-collar crime. It was nonviolent, but there was a lot of harm done, and he wanted them to admit that guilt, to say, I'm sorry. And most of them would not do it, because remember, you're innocent until proven guilty, right? So here we see this, instead of just being, you know, a fraud alone, we see it rising to the nature of a RICO crime. Okay, because, as you see here, on the bottom of the screen, there's a pattern of this illegal activity. This was going on for a number of years, right? Dating back to 2005, so there's a pattern of this cheating on the test. What's the enterprise involved here? What's the organization? The school, right? They're doing it as part of an organization. Yeah, they're not the mafia. It's not organized crime from that sense, but it's still an organization, a business they're really working out of. And they're engaging in illegal activity. There's easily 2 or more crimes we see these teachers being a part of. So the harshest sentence was 7 years in jail, right? But this says 20 plus years in prison. So there was also, if you saw accompanying it, 13 years of probation time for a cumulative 20 years. So they really wanted to put down harsh sentences. They didn't just take this as fraud alone. They made it as severe as a RICO crime. Interesting, huh? See, teachers can be bad too.
What is RICO stands for again?
So going back to RICO, that's a really easy to say. The Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act is RICO. And again, this provides more severe penalties for organized crime if you're engaging in 2 or more crimes. We're going to move on now to some of the additional crimes. Okay, let me stop this for a moment.